Hey, welcome back to 7 Days to Shadow. I know it's been a while since I did one of these, couple months. You know, life gets in the way. I usually do this when everyone's asleep, which everyone is almost never asleep, and by the time they're asleep, I'm too fucking tired to do it. So this is going to be chapters 54 through 55 or 56. It's going to be a quick video. I hope I don't have a whole lot of time to go through more than one or two chapters. Also, announcement, I'm starting another channel called Heroes and Villains of Literature, where I'm going to be talking about known and unknown protagonists from books I've read and other people have read. The first video is going to be pretty awesome. It's going to be about Lestat from the Vampire Chronicles. That's probably going to be a long video because I know so much about that guy. I'm going to have a lot to say. So check that out, and let's get started with this so I can get up out of here. Enjoy.
Chapter 54. Regnus Gyre ducked back into a hallway as Brant Aegon ran past with a dozen royal guards, and inexplicably, a few fat nobles. "Long live the king! To the prince!" one of them yelled. To the prince? The rumors must have been wrong then. Regnus had heard that Elayne Gundar had been murdered last night. Had the Lord General been alone, Regnus would have called out to his old friend, but not with Vin Arturian there. Vin was duty-bound to arrest Regnus, and he would, even if he didn't like it. There was shouting in the distance, toward the center of the castle, but Regnus couldn't make out any words. Having so much happened that he didn't understand made him anxious, but he could do nothing about whatever was happening elsewhere in the castle. He only had 6 men, none of them in armor. It had been hard enough to smuggle themselves in as servants and still bring swords. All he could hope to do was find Nalia and get her out of here. The Queen's chambers were on the 2nd floor of the castle in the northeast quarter. Regnus and his men had been walking through the castle nonchalantly, in 2 groups of 3, trying not to attract the servants' attention. But now he gestured sharply. His men gathered around him, and he started jogging. They got to the Queen's chamber without running into a single servant or guard. It was unbelievably good luck. Against even a pair of royal guards who would be armed and armored, Regnus and his unarmored men might all have died. Regnus pounded on the great door, and then opened it. A lady-in-waiting who'd been about to open the door fell back in surprise. "You!" she said. "Milady, run! Murderer!" Nalia Gundar was seated in a rocking chair, embroidery obviously untouched in her lap. She stood immediately, but waved the servant off. "Don't be a fool. Be gone." Her 2 younger daughters, Elena and Elise, both looked like they had been crying. They stood uncertainly, neither old enough to recognize Duke Gyre. "What are you doing here?" Queen Nalia asked. "How did you get here?" "Your life's in danger. The man who attacked my estate last night has been hired to kill you tonight. Please not. Please, my queen." He looked away. "My lord," she said. It was how a queen might greet a favored vassal. It was also how a lady might address her husband. In those 2 words, Regnus heard her say, "I've never loved anyone but you." "My lord," she said again. "Regnus, I'll go wherever you lead. But we can't go without them. If I'm in danger, they are too. Your girls can come along. I mean, Logan and Janine. They wed this afternoon. Long live the king. To the prince. The nobles' brief cries suddenly made sense. They'd abbreviated it. The king is dead, long live the king. They meant, long live the new king, the prince. Logan. King Gunder was dead. Logan was the new king. A better man would have had other thoughts first, Regnus knew. A better husband would have had other thoughts first, but his first thought was that Nalia's husband was dead. The hateful little man who'd caused so much misery was gone. His own wife was gone too. He and Nalia were both suddenly, miraculously freed from 22 years of bondage. 22 years. And what he'd thought was a life sentence had suddenly been commuted. He'd consigned himself to the satisfactions of a proud father and an able commander, never believing that he'd have anything but marital agony to come home to. Now, happiness wasn't just a dim possibility. It was here, one step away, beaming at him, eyes full of love. What a difference it would be to come home to Nalia, to share her home, her conversation, her life, her bed. If she would have him, he could marry Nalia. He would marry her. The other implications came to him more slowly. Logan was the new king. The genealogists would have nightmares if Regnus and Nalia had children. He didn't care. He laughed aloud. His heart was so light. Then he stopped. Aegon, the guards, and the nobles had been running to his son, armed with dinner knives. Logan was in danger. Those men had been running to save him. Logan was in danger, and Regnus had turned aside. There wasn't time to explain everything, to tell Nalia that she was free, that Helain was dead. Regnus had to act. He had no idea how much time they had left. "They're in trouble. Follow me," Regnus shouted, lifting his sword.
I really love this jeep.
Something hot lanced through his back.
I mean, it's not as fast
and
as
then
I
was
thought
gone.
it would be, but
Regnus
it's
turned and
convenient.
rubbed his chest, irritated. He saw something black flit into the shadows as blood suddenly bloomed from one of his men's throats. As if they were marionettes whose strings had been cut, his men fell, one after another in rapid succession, dead. Regnus's hand came away from his chest, sticky. He looked down. Blood was spreading on the front of his tunic over his heart. He looked up at Nalia. A shadow was behind her, holding her. One black hand held her chin up. The other held the long, thin short sword that had killed Regnus. But Nalia's eyes were fixed on him, and wide with horror. "Nalia," he said. He dropped to his knees. His vision was going white. He tried to keep his eyes open, but then he realized his eyes were open, and it didn't matter anymore. Lord General Aegon and his ragtag band of nobles and royal guards were not making good time. Through the centuries, the castle had undergone several expansions and no simplifications. Twice, the general's men had been stopped by a locked door, argued the relative merits of hacking it down or going around, and decided to go another way. Now, they ran down the last hallway to the North Tower, the royal guards sprinting, Aegon running, and several of the nobles wheezing their way down the long hall.
We love you.
The nobles had long since given up their earlier enthusiastic cries of "To the Prince" and "Long live
Guess it
King
has its
Jair."
limits.
They were saving their breath now. Aegon entered the tower's antechamber to the sound of men cursing and beating at the door to the stairs. One of the royal guards, Colonel Gare, was standing at the entrance to the antechamber. "Hurry, my lords!"
Come on.
he urged the last two paunchy nobles. Scanning the room, Lord Aegon let the younger, more athletic men attack the
Creation,
thick
get
door to the
out,
stairs.
get out, man.
The room wasn't
Fucking
large,
drive.
barely 20 feet square, sparsely furnished with ceilings so high
Come on,
they were
drive,
lost in the
drive.
darkness. And just 2 doors. One to the stairs, and one to the hall. There was no going around this door. Something wasn't right. That the door was locked meant that the guards posted here had either been killed or subverted. Lord General Aegon looked over his shoulder to where Colonel Gare was ushering the last nobles into the room. Aegon pushed past Logan's cousin, the fat Lord Logyre, and started to shout a warning. But before he could get a word out, Colonel Gare's mailed fist caught him in the chin. Falling backward, Aegon could only watch from the floor as Colonel Gare slammed the doors and threw the bolt. One of the royal guards threw his shoulders into the door an instant later,
There we go.
but it held. And a moment later,
This must be the
Aegon
irradiated
heard the
zone
door
that
being
I've heard so much
barred.
about.
Trapped, Lord Urware said helpfully.
I'm dying yet, so
For a
maybe I'll
moment.
just...
Everyone in the room stopped. As the Lord General stood with the assistance of one of the royal guards, he could see the implications hitting the men. If they'd just been betrayed by one of their own, then the attempt on the prince's life wasn't isolated or poorly planned. Everything in the last few days had been orchestrated, from Prince Aeline's death to their
Damn,
own
it's
arrival
like
at
they
this dead
put
end.
these rocks in the way,
Their odds of
so I can't
surviving
climb the fucking mountain.
weren't good. What do we do, sir?
Like I'm getting stuck
the
on
guards
every fucking
asked.
rock that I run into.
Get through that door, Lord Aegon said, pointing to the door guarding the stairs. It was
Come
probably
on!
too late. They would probably find enemy soldiers and dead royals up those stairs. But Aegon had long ago learned not to waste time on the battlefield lamenting what you should have done, what you should have seen. Recriminations could come later, if there was a later. The guards had renewed their assault on the door when the twang hiss of a crossbow bolt rang out. A royal guard went down, his mailed chest pierced as easily as if he'd been wearing silk. Aegon cursed and stared around the room for murder holes in the walls. He could see none. The men looked around wildly, trying to
there's
guard
nothing to
against
get
an
stuck
enemy
on,
that
and I
attacked
just-
from
I
nowhere.
hit a fucking blade
Twang,
of grass,
hiss.
and I'm like, ugh.
Another guard stumbled into his comrades and fell dead. Aegon and the men looked up into the darkness. A low-hanging chandelier destroyed their chances of seeing beyond it. A low laugh echoed out of the gloom it hid. Guards and nobles alike scrambled for whatever cover they could find, but there was precious little to be had. One soldier rolled behind a thickly stuffed wing-backed chair. A noble tore a portrait of Sir Robin from a wall and held it before himself like a shield. "The door!" Aegon barked, though his heart was clouding with despair. There was no way out. The man or men shooting them not only had numbers and traitors in the castle, they also knew the castle's secrets. The paranoid King Herlac had honeycombed his expansion of the castle with secret rooms and spy holes. Because he knew where they were, this assassin had merely to sit in place and murder them all. There was no way to stop him. Twang! Hiss! The soldier sitting behind the great chair stiffened as the bolt tore through the chair's back and penetrated his. The assassin was letting them know the hopelessness of their plight. "The door!" Aegon shouted. With the kind of courage many commanders would demand, but few would get, the rest of the guards jumped up and began hacking at the door. They knew that some of them would die doing it, but they also knew it was their only way out, their only hope for life. Twang! Hiss! Another royal guard crumpled in the middle of a swing at the door. Lord Ungert, weakly holding the portrait before himself, wailed like a little girl. Twang! Hiss! A soldier seemed to leap sideways as a bolt punched through his ear hole and threw him bloodily into the door frame. A rent appeared in the door. One of the remaining 3 royal guards gave a shout of triumph. An arrow flew in through the gash in the door and buried itself in his shoulder. The man spun around once before a bolt from above clove his spine. Both of the last 2 guards snapped. One dropped his sword and fell to his knees. "Please," he begged. "Please no! Please no! Please!" The last was Captain Arturian. He attacked the door like a man possessed. He was a strong man, and the door shuddered and rocked under his blows, the gap widening, stretching to reach the latch. He dodged as 2 arrows sped through the hole and past his head, then attacked once more. Another arrow streaked past Vin Arturian, and Aegon saw his head whip back. His cheek had been grazed, cut in a neat line, his ear sliced in half. Screaming, Captain Arturian threw his sword through the hole like a spear. He grabbed the latch and tore it out of the door, jerking as an arrow went into his arm
Apparently
and
there are
out the
no
other
negative
side.
effects to
Ignoring it, he seized the door and heaved,
driving around in
tearing it from the
radiation for
frame.
5 minutes.
5 Caladoran archers, wearing Cenarian livery, stood on the stairs with arrows drawn. 6 swordsmen and a witch stood behind them. Another archer lay at their feet, the guard's sword sprouting from his stomach. The 5 archers released their arrows simultaneously. Riddled with arrows, Captain Vin Arturian dropped backward. His body landed next to the guard on his knees, who shrieked. Twang! Hiss! The shriek ended in a gurgle, and the young man fell, drowning in his own blood. Then came one of those eerily normal moments in the chaos of battle that Lord Aegon had seen before, but could never get used to. One of the archers handed his bow off, stepped into the room, and grabbed the door. "Excuse me," he said to the captain he'd just helped kill. His voice wasn't sarcastic, simply polite. He pulled the door out of the captain's death-clenched fingers, stepped back into the stairwell, and propped the door in place as Lord Aegon and the nobles watched him. In that no time before reality came crushing back into place, Lord Aegon looked at the nobles. They looked at him. These were the men who'd been willing to put their own lives at stake to rescue the prince. Brave men, if some of them fools, he thought as he looked at Lord Ungert shielding himself with a painting. These were the men he'd led to death. The trap was clever. The Gyre servant who'd announced the attack on Logan had doubtless been one of the usurper's men. The ploy not only split the royal guard, taking most of them away from the Great Hall, it also neatly separated the wheat from the chaff. The lords who had come with Aegon weren't even exactly the men he himself would have expected to defend Prince Logan, but they were all men who had shown their loyalties in the only way that mattered: with their actions. By killing these men, the Calador would eliminate the very men most likely to oppose them. Brilliant. Under the sound of the dying soldiers' gurgling and rasping breath, Aegon heard another sound. His ears identified it immediately. It was a crossbow's windlass being cranked. Click, click, click. Click, click, click. "So you know whom to curse as you die?" a voice, darkly amused, said from his hideout above them. "I'm Prince Roth Ursul." "Ursul," Lord Brayton cursed. "Oh, it's an honor then," Lord Lojaya said. The bolt caught Lojaya through his fat stomach and struck with such force that it tore out of his back, taking a good part of his viscera with it. He sat roughly against a wall. Several of the lords damned Ursule, as he had invited. Some went to comfort Lord Logyre, wheezing and shaking on the floor. Lord General Aegon remained standing. Death would find him on his feet. Click, click, click. Click, click, click. "I want to thank you, Lord General," Roth said. "You have served me well. First you killed the king for me, a nice bit of treason, that. And then, despite that, you were able to lead these men to my trap. You will be rewarded well." "What?" Old Lord Brayton asked, looking at Brant with alarm. "Say it's not true, Brant." The next bolt went through Lord Brayton's heart. "It's a lie," Lord Aegon said. But Lord Brayton was dead. Click, click, click. Click, click, click. Lord Ungert looked at Aegon, terrified. The canvas shook in his hands. "Please, tell him to stop," he begged Aegon as he saw that he was the last noble standing. "I didn't even want to follow you. My wife made me." A small hole appeared in Sir Robin's painted shield, and Lord Ungert staggered backwards. For a long moment, he stood against the wall, grimacing, canvas still in hand. He looked disgusted, as if the canvas should have stopped the crossbow bolt. Then he fell on the painting, breaking the frame to splinters. Click, click, click. Click, click, click. "Bastard!" Lord Logyre said between thin gasps, staring at Lord General Aegon. "You bastard!" The next bolt hit Lord Logyre between the eyes. Lord General Aegon raised his sword defiantly. Roth laughed. "I wasn't lying, Lord General. You'll have your reward." "I'm not afraid," Lord General Aegon said. Click, click, click. Click, click, click. The bolt hit Aegon's knee, and he felt bones shatter. He stumbled to the chair and fell. Moments later, another bolt tore through his elbow. It felt like it had torn his arm off. He barely held himself sitting on the floor, clutching the arm of the chair like a man drowning. "My wet boy told me I could trust you to run blindly into this trap. After all, you were stupid enough to trust him," Roth said. "Blit! Yeah. Didn't tell me you'd betray your king. That was delicious. And marrying Lord Gyre into the royal family? Friend of yours, isn't he? You cost Logan his life with that. I know you're not afraid to die, Lord General," Roth said. "The reward I give you is your life. Go, live with your shame. Go on now. Crawl away, little bug. I'll spend the rest of my sorry life hunting you down," Aegon said between gritted teeth. "No, you won't. You're a whipped dog, Brant. You could have stopped me. Instead, you helped me every step of the way. My men and I are going upstairs now. The prince and princess will die because you didn't stop me. So, why would I kill you? I couldn't have done this without you." Roth left the Lord General there, gasping on the floor, shattered. Chapter 55. Sergeant Bamron Gamble drew the Alatiran longbow with the broad muscle of his back. It didn't matter if you were as strong as an ox. You couldn't draw an Alatiran longbow with your arms. The bow was thick yew, 7 feet long, unstrung, and it could punch through armor at 200 paces. He'd heard of men hitting a 4-foot target at over 500 paces, but thank the God he didn't need to do that. He stood on the roof of the guardhouse in the castle yard. They'd been barricaded in by a traitor, but the coward had either not had the stomach or not had the torch to set fire to the guardhouse with them inside it. Gamble's men had knocked a hole in the roof and lifted him out. The witch's first bolt had flown high past the sergeant's head before he'd even strung his bow. The witch was the only Meister in the yard, stationed to keep an eye on things, evidently. From Gamble's perch, he could see that more troops were streaming over the East Kingsbridge even now, but he had eyes only for the witch. It was a woman, her hair red, skin pale. She was breathing heavily, as if the last bolt had taken something out of her, but she was already pulling herself together, chanting, the black veer on her arms straining. If he missed, he wouldn't get a second shot. The witch would aim this shot low, and it would set fire to the thatch roof of the guardhouse. More than 40 of Sergeant Gamble's men would die. His back flexed, and the broad head slid back. 3 fingers slid toward his face. The gut string touched his lips. There was no aiming. It was purely instinctive. A ball of fire ignited between the witch's palms. The broadhead jumped right through the flame, and the power that would have carried the arrow through armor had no trouble piercing ethereal flame or a young woman's sternum. She was blasted off her feet as if tied to a horse at full gallop. The arrow pinned her body to the great door behind her. Sergeant Gamble wasn't conscious of having drawn another bow. If he'd had another choice, he would have chosen to get off the roof and let his men out. But suddenly, battle was singing in his veins. After 17 years as a soldier, he was fighting for the first time. The arrow touched his lips and leapt away. This one hit another witch, leading a file of Highlanders across the bridge. It was a brilliant shot, one of the best shots of Gamble's entire life. It flew between 3 rows of running soldiers and hit a witch in the armpit as she pumped her arms while running. It blew her sideways, off the edge of the bridge. She tumbled, limp, into the waters of the Plyth. The Highlanders didn't even slow. That was when Sergeant Gamble knew they were in trouble. The archers and a witch peeled off from the group and began looking for him, but all the other men proceeded across the bridge. As the archers drew their arrows, the witch touched each, and fire attached to each arrowhead. Gamble slid down the roof and dropped into the yard as 2 burning arrows sank into the thatch. The fire spread unnaturally fast. By the time he unbarred the door, there was already smoke pouring out of the inside of the barracks. "What do we do, sir?" one of the men asked as they crowded around him. "They can't take us all at once, so they're trying to separate us. I'd guess there's 2, maybe 300 of them. We gotta get to the lower barracks." There would be 200 men there. That would be even odds, at least. Not that Sergeant Gamble thought even numbers would even anything, not against Caladoran Highlanders and witches. "To hell with that," a young guard said. "I'm not dying for Niner. We still got East Kingsbridge. I'm out of here." "You head for that bridge, Jules, and it's the last thing you'll do," Sergeant Gamble said. "That is what they pay us for. Anything less than our duty is betrayal. Just like Conyers locking us in the barracks to die." "They don't pay us shit." "We knew what they paid when we signed up." "You do what you gotta do, sir." Jules sheathed his sword and turned confidently. He started jogging for the bridge. Every man of his 39 was looking at Sergeant Gamble. He drew, whispered a prayer for 2 souls as the string touched his lips, and sent the arrow through the back of Jules's neck. I'm turning into a regular war hero, aren't I? Skilled at killing women and my own men. "We're going to fight," he said. "Any questions?" Kylar sprinted through the servants' quarters unseen. Still no soldiers had come running. Things had to be bad somewhere for the soldiers not to have organized any resistance. Abruptly, he was on a fight. At least 1 detachment of Highlanders must have come in another way, because 20 of them were busy slaughtering twice as many Cenarian soldiers. The Cenarians were on the verge of breaking, even as their sergeant was bellowing orders at them. The sight of the man's face stopped Kylar. He knew that sergeant. It was Gamble, the guard who'd come into the North Tower the day of Kylar's first kill. Kylar joined the fray and killed Caledorans as easily as a scythe cuts wheat. It was simple labor. There was no joy in killing men who could barely see him. At first, no one noticed him. He was a smear of darkness deep in the bowels of a castle constructed of dark stone and lit with flickering torches. Then he saved Gamble's life, beheading one Caledoran and eviscerating another as they cornered the officer. Kylar didn't even slow. He was a whirlwind. He was the first face of the Night Angels. He was vengeance. Killing was no longer an activity. It was a state of being. Kylar became killing. If every drop of guilty blood he spilled might blot out a drop of innocent blood, he would be clean tonight. The feeling of mail parting, of leather parting, of flesh parting along the icy judgment that was retribution, was the best feeling in the world. Kylar was lost in a madness, a kind of bizarre meditation, spinning, thrusting, lunging, cleaving, piercing, battering, smashing, ruining face-snuffing futures. It passed all too quickly, for in what could have been more than half a minute, every last Caledoran was dead. None was even dying. The killing wrath was nothing, if not thorough. The effect on the Cenarians was monumental. These sheep in guards' armor stood, gaping at the ragged darkness that was Kylar. Their weapons weren't even raised. They didn't stand in ready positions. They just marveled at Death's avatar among them. "The Night Angel fights for you," he said. He'd already paused too long. Logan could be dying right now. He ran deeper into the castle. All the doors were closed, and the halls were eerily quiet. He could only assume that the servants were huddled in their rooms or already fleeing. The pounding of many footsteps keeping time brought him up short. Kylar sank into a shadowed doorway near a corner. He might be safe from the eyes of men, but there were things more dangerous than men in the castle tonight. "There must be a good 200 of their soldiers trapped downstairs," one of the officers was saying to a man whose narrow build gave him away as a witch, even though he wore armor and a sword. "It'll hold for maybe 15 minutes, Meister." "And the nobles in the garden?" the witch demanded. His answer was lost in the tramp of the Highlanders' feet as they wound past Kylar and into the distance. So, the nobles were trapped in the garden. Kylar had never been to the garden before, indeed, had avoided the castle as much as possible, but he'd seen paintings of the garden, and if the artist hadn't taken too much license, Kylar supposed he could find it. He guessed that was as good of a place as any to look for Logan and Durzo. As he wound deeper into the castle toward the garden, dead men began to clutter the halls, their blood slickening the floors. Kylar didn't even slow as he ran past. The dead were mostly nobles' guards. Poor bastards. Kylar didn't have much sympathy for men who took up the profession of arms and then didn't train themselves, but these men had been massacred. Well over 40 guards were dead and dying, kicking and frothing in pain. Kylar only saw 8 Highlanders dead. Following the blood and the corpses led Kylar to double doors of walnut, barred from the outside. He lifted the bar and eased the door open. "What in the hell?" a gruff voice with a Caledoran accent said. Retreating from the crack, to stand behind yet another picture of Niner standing in a heroic pose, Kylar saw several Highlanders guarding a room full of nobles. There were men, women, and even a few children in the group. They were disheveled and frightened. Some were crying, some were throwing up. Poisoned. Footsteps tapped across the floor from behind Kylar's line of sight, and the Highlanders he could see readied their weapons. The point of a halberd hooked the corner of the door and pulled it open, revealing a squat Caladoran officer as thick as he was tall. The officer pulled the other door open with the halberd. Then he beckoned, and two men jumped into the hall, back to back, swords raised. They looked right at the statue, right at Kylar, who'd pressed himself against the statue's back, putting his arms behind its arms, his legs behind its legs. "Nothing, sir," one said. Inside the garden, which wasn't nearly as grand as it looked in the paintings, were 10 guards and 40 or 50 nobles, none of them armed. Mercifully, the Highlanders had no witches with them. Kylar assumed witches were too valuable to be wasted guarding prisoners. The nobles included some of the highest in the land. Kylar recognized more than a few of the king's ministers. That they were all here meant that Roth believed he would take over the castle quickly, and he wanted to be able to personally decide whom to kill and whom to add to his own government. The men and women looked dazed. They didn't seem to believe what had happened to them. It was beyond their comprehension that their world could turn so completely upside down so quickly. Many were obviously ill. Some were torn and bloodied, but others were absolutely untouched. Some ladies whose hair was still perfectly coiffed wept, while others bearing gashes and torn skirts seemed poised and calm. Behind Kylar, a soldier said, "Bleeding mercy, Captain. It didn't just unbar itself. We're here to guard this room, and we stay here." "But we don't know what's out there, sir." "We stay," the squat captain said in a voice that brooked no argument. Kylar almost felt bad for the young Highlander. The young man's instincts were right. One day he'd have been a good officer. But that didn't stop Kylar from dropping the shadows a pace away from him. He told himself he wasn't becoming visible to be fair. He'd need his strength later. The young Caladoran's sword had barely cleared its scabbard when Kylar disemboweled him. Then he danced past the man, throwing a knife with his left hand, parting hardened leather armor and ribs with an upward cut, and guiding a sword hand past his side and the sword into another soldier's body in a smooth motion. Kylar jerked his head forward into a Highlander's face and spun with the man quickly. The man's back absorbed the captain's halberd with a meaty crunch. Kylar dropped under a slash and stabbed up into a Highlander's groin with his wakizashi. On his back, he knocked the man backward with a kick and used the force of the kick to spring to his feet. 6 men were dead or down. 4 remained. The first was impetuous. He charged with a yell, something about Kylar killing his brother. A parry and riposte, and brother joined brother. The last 3 moved forward together. A quick cut deprived one of sword and sword hand, and the next crossed swords with Kylar 5 times before he didn't dodge back far enough and fell eyeless from the slash across his face. Kylar jumped over the sweeping halberd and turned to face the officer. He reversed his grip on the sword and stabbed behind him, impaling the one-armed soldier. The officer dropped the halberd and drew a rapier. Kylar smiled at the extremes of the man's weapon choices and then looked over the officer's shoulder. The man started to turn, frowned, and didn't look back. A pretty noblewoman smashed the back of his head with a planter. Flowers and soil flew everywhere, but the planter itself didn't so much as crack. "Thank you for saving us," she panted. "But damn you for looking at me. You could have gotten me killed." She was one of the women whose hair and makeup had been the least disturbed by whatever violence had brought her here. She looked completely unruffled by having just crushed a man's skull. She merely brushed dirt from her dress and checked to see if she'd dragged it through any blood. Kylar was surprised that she hadn't spilled out of her low-cut dress when she'd run. He recognized her. He didn't look back, did he? Kylar asked Tara Grayson, glad for the black silk kerchief over his face. He'd worn the mask out of habit, but if he hadn't, some of these nobles would have recognized him. Well, I never. There was a knock on the door, and she and everyone else froze. 3 knocks, 2 knocks, 3, 2. A voice called out, "New orders, Cap. His Majesty says to kill 'em all. We need your soldiers to help quell resistors in the courtyard." "You need to leave, immediately," Kylar said loudly enough that all the nobles could hear him. "That's at least 200 more Highlanders coming over West Kingsbridge. They're probably the ones fighting in the courtyard right now. If you want to live, collect whatever weapons you can and free the soldiers who are trapped downstairs. Others are already heading there. With them, you can make it out of the castle. You can start a resistance. You've already lost the castle. You've lost the city. If you don't move fast, you'll lose your lives." The news hit the nobles, crowding around Kylar like cold water. Some of them shrank even more, but a few of them seemed to find their backbone as he spoke. "We'll fight, sir," Tara Grayson said. "But some of us have been poisoned." "I know those poisons. If you've lived this long, you've taken a small enough dose that you'll recover within a half hour. Where's Logan Gyre?" "Excuse me. I'm Tara Grayson, now Queen Grayson. If you—" Kylar's eyes narrowed. "Where's Logan Gyre?" "Dead. He's dead. The king's dead. The queen's dead. The princesses are dead. All of them." The world rocked. Kylar felt as if he'd been clubbed in the stomach. "Are you sure? Did you see it?" "We were with the king in the great hall when he died, and I found the queen and her younger daughters in their chambers before I got caught. They were... It was awful." She shook her head. "I didn't see Logan and Janine, but they must have been the first to die. After the king announced their marriage, they'd not left the Great Hall 10 minutes before the coup started. The Lord General took men to try to save them, but he was too late. These men were just bragging about how they slaughtered the royal guards." "Where?" "I don't know, but it's too—" "Does anyone know where Logan went?" Kylar shouted. He saw from the looks on their faces that some of them knew, but they weren't going to tell him because they were afraid he would leave them. The cowards! He heard a moan further back in the garden, and he pushed through the standing nobles to see a pasty, pale man sweating on his back. His mouth was crusted with froth, and there was a puddle of vomit near his head. He looked so bad that Kylar almost didn't recognize him. It was Count Drake. Kylar knelt by the Count and grabbed leaves from his herb pouch and began stuffing them in the Count's mouth. "You have an antidote?" one of the sick but standing nobles asked. "Give it to me." "Give it to me!" another demanded. They began pushing forward. Kylar whipped retribution out and put the point on a noble's throat. "If any of you touch me or him, I'll kill you. I swear." "He's only a count," a fat, quivering noblewoman said. "He's poor. I'll give you anything." The hard, vengeful part of Kylar wanted to withhold the antidote, just to repay their meanness, their pettiness. Instead, he grabbed the bag of antidote and tossed it to Tara Grayson. "Give it to those who need it most. It won't save anyone who's already unconscious, and anyone still standing doesn't need it." Her mouth opened at being so frankly commanded, but she obeyed. Time was slipping through Kylar's fingers. He was here. He was in the castle, but he had no idea where in the castle he needed to be. He looked down at the Count, wondering if he was too late to save him. The Count stirred. His eyes opened, slowly focused. He was going to make it. "North Tower," he said. "That's where Logan went?" The Count nodded, and then lay back, exhausted. "It's too late for them," Tara Grayson said. "Fight with us. I'll give you lands, titles, a pardon." But heedless of the noble's gasps, Kylar wrapped himself in shadows and ran. Roth's men pounded up the stairs and kicked open the door to the bedchamber. Roth and Nef Dada followed as the 11 men pressed into the room amid grunts and cries. Even though the double doors were wide enough for 3 abreast, with 4 ranks of men in front of him, Roth couldn't see what was happening, except to know that it wasn't good. There was the sound of flesh hitting flesh, the sound of a sword cutting through mail, the sound of a skull bursting like a melon. Beside him, Nef Dada had extended his veer-marked arms. He muttered, and a quarter of the veer wriggled. An eerily silent concussion blew men in every direction. Even Roth's men were blasted off their feet. The 3 directly in front of him hurtled backward, but as Roth braced for the impact, they smacked against an invisible barrier Nef had erected to protect him. Nef spoke again, and the room filled with light. Roth stepped inside with Nef as everyone recovered. Logan tried to jump to his feet, too, but his limbs were anchored to the floor as if by a great weight. He was naked and furious. Roth sheathed his sword as 8 of his men collected their scattered weapons. 6 men lay on the floor, all bleeding from deep wounds. 3 of them were dead. 3 would be soon. Apparently, Logan Gyre was no slouch with a sword. On the bed, wearing a hiked-up, translucent nightgown, lay the princess. She was thrashing, terrified, but she couldn't cover herself. Nef had immobilized her, too. Roth sat down on the bed next to the girl and let his eyes roam over her nubile body. He licked a finger, put it at the base of her neck, and traced it down her body. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," he said. Janine Gunder's eyes flashed. She was blushing from his casual perusal, but she was furious, too. Roth put a finger to her lips and shushed her before she could say anything. "I just came to congratulate you on your recent nuptials, my dove," he said. "How is everything? Are you satisfied with the wealth of your husband's endowments?" he asked. He looked over at the naked Logan and scowled. "Well, I suppose you are. And my dear Duke Gyre, stand him up," Roth ordered. "Or should I say, Prince Gyre? Don't lose heart. I've seen her mother naked, and in time she'll—" Logan lunged forward, but his bonds held. One of the men hit him across the face. Roth continued, as if there had been no interruption. He clucked his tongue. "In time. There's the rub. In time, the princess might grow into these rather admirable breasts and hips." He smiled at her and pinched a cheek. Roth stood, and Nef's magic lifted Janine from the bed to stand, trembling next to her husband. "But you don't have time. I hope you've enjoyed your marriage, and Logan, friend, I hope you've not been wasting your time with foreplay, because your marriage is over." The moment drew out. There was nothing Roth loved so much as watching bewilderment turn to dread, turn to despair. "Who are you?" Logan asked, his eyes betraying no fear. "I'm Roth. I'm the man who ordered your brother's death, Janine." Ignoring Logan, Roth watched the words break over the girl like a wave, but he didn't stop, didn't let her voice a denial. "I'm Roth, the Shinga of the Sakage. I'm the man who ordered your father's death, Janine, not 10 minutes ago. I watched his head roll off the high table. I'm Prince Roth Orsul of Calador. I'm the man who ordered your sister's and your mother's deaths, Janine. If you listen, you might hear their cries. He put a finger to his ear and an attentive look on his face, mocking. You two are all that's left between me and Cenaria's crown, Janine. And I'm going to take that crown. I'm afraid I'm going to have to kill you. Do you want to choose which of you dies first? With each revelation, he watched her eyes, fed hungrily on her dying hope, gorged himself on her ripening despair. Roth drew a knife and turned her so she faced Logan. Logan cried out wordlessly, but Neff had gagged him. He bucked and strained against the bonds, his muscles taut, swelling huge, but escaping Neff's magic was impossible. He could sooner tear stars from the heavens. "My lord," a soldier called from the hall, "one of the barges has been destroyed. The Meisters need you to help quell the resistance." Watching the hope bloom in the young girl's eyes gave Roth a shiver of excitement. "Resistance," he said. "Maybe they'll save you, but wait. Your hero is already here. Logan, are you just going to stand there? Aren't you going to save her?" The muscles in Logan's arms and legs bulged, and the magical bonds shifted and thinned until Neff spoke again, and they redoubled. The prince couldn't move. "I guess not," Roth said, turning back to Janine. "But you're the princess. Surely the royal guards will come. Why, I bet even now the Lord General is leading men here to rescue you." He brushed his hair back over a mangled ear. "But I killed Aegon, and all the royal guards. There are no more heroes. No one can save you, Janine." Roth stepped behind Janine and trailed his free hand up her slender stomach. He ripped her nightgown open, tore it off, and cupped a breast in his hand. As a tear rolled from her eye, he bent and kissed her neck like a lover, his eyes locked on Logan's, mocking. Then, where he'd kissed her, he cut her throat. Roth gave her a shove, and Janine stumbled into Logan's arms, the right side of her neck a fountain of blood. Neff loosed Logan's bonds enough that he could hold the girl, but not enough to reach up to try to stop the bleeding. Logan's eyes were wells of horror and pity, a sound like beatific music to Roth's ears, the sound of a soul at its utmost limit of suffering, escaped Logan's lips. He held the small, gasping girl to his chest. Roth devoured his horror, trying to lock this memory into his mind, knowing he would need this on the long, dark nights. But then Logan pulled back, turned so Roth couldn't see his face, and looked into Janine's face. "I'm here, Jenny," Logan said, holding the girl's eyes with his own. "I'm not going to leave you." The gentleness in his voice infuriated Roth. It was as if Roth didn't matter anymore. With his soothing voice, Logan was pulling Janine and himself out of this world of darkness, walling them off somewhere Roth couldn't go. As Janine stared into Logan's eyes, Roth could see her relax, not into death, but from despair. "You really would have loved me, wouldn't you?" she said. Roth knew he should have cut deeper, should have slashed her windpipe, and not just that single artery. He struck Logan across the face, but his blow might have been the buzzing of a gnat for all it did. The big man didn't even lose eye contact with the princess. "Jenny, Jenny," he said quietly. "I already love you. I'll be with you soon." "You're dying!" Roth shouted, not a pace away, but he might have been a summer breeze. Janine's knees trembled, and Logan pulled her back into his embrace, closing his eyes and whispering in her ear as her life bled out against his chest. "My lord, they need you now," the messenger said more urgently. Logan didn't even look at Roth as Janine shuddered against his chest. He just kept whispering assurances. She sucked in 3 more labored breaths and then sighed her life out in Logan's arms, her eyes fluttering closed. Neff released the bonds holding her slowly, and she crumpled to the floor. "No! No!" Roth yelled. She wasn't even afraid. He'd done everything right, and she wasn't even afraid to die. Who wasn't afraid to die? It wasn't right. It wasn't fair. He slapped Logan once and again and again and again. "You won't die so easy, Logan Gyre," Roth snarled. He turned to his men. The muscle in his jaw twitched. "Take him to the maw and give him to the sodomites." "My lord," the messenger said, rushing into the room again, "you must—" He grabbed a handful of the messenger's hair. He stabbed at the man's face in a fury, wildly, again and again. He flung the man sideways and tried to cut his throat, but caught him above the ear instead. The knife turned, and a fat strip of hairy scalp came off in Roth's hand. The man wailed until Roth grabbed him again and cut his throat. Meanwhile, Neff had opened the hidden door out of the chamber. He lifted the princess's body with magic and floated it before him. "Neff, what are you doing?" "The God King wishes to have the heads of all the royal family displayed. Whatever you're planning, I'd advise you to hurry." He didn't address Roth by his title. Everything was going wrong, and Father would be here soon. Roth turned, panting, the gory strip of hair and flesh in his fist. He trembled with rage, and the men holding Logan went as white as paste. "Bring me his head when they're finished. But before you give him to the sodomites, cut his cock off and bring me his sack for a purse. I want him to bleed to death as they fuck him."